Well, we're coming up to the spring holy days of God. If you don't know what the spring holy days are, that's another message, and I'm sure most of you do, and many of you online, maybe not all. And there are so many lessons we can learn from our ancestors. I'm one to ask questions, and I'm always wondering, what did my family, I'm adopted, so I have a lot more people in my family, and I'm always asking questions about what happened here and then. And recently I saw a thing that from 1980 to now, I think it was 80, is just as long as from now to another date, and I'm like, wait a minute, time out here. But like you folks, I won't even begin to ask you what you've seen in your lives, your lifetimes, over 90 years old and close to 90, not yet, but getting close. And I want to just touch on a story, and then we're going to develop that. You've heard of the Israelites. I don't mean the Israelis. There's a difference. Recently someone said, what's the difference? Israelis are folks that live in Israel right now. The Israelites were a nation, that nation. Some of the ancestors there, family members passed down, still live there. The Israelites made a tragic choice on Passover Day in history, taking with them something from Egypt they should have left behind. Now you're thinking, wow, what was that? So I have a question. I like to ask questions. I have a question for you and those of you connected and me today, and I'd like you to soberly consider this question as we talk about it during this message. Here's the question. What part of Egypt might we have brought with us? Does that matter? You may say, well, wait a minute. I've never been to Egypt. My wife and I have had the privilege to travel all over the world, and we've not been to Egypt. It's on our bucket list, but our bucket list got dumped out in aisle 6 of Walmart, and all the vegetables and fruit went everywhere with no more bags a couple years ago, as far as flying anyway, and doing many things. You may say you've never been in Egypt, and my comment to that is, well, actually you have. And we'll talk about that. What excitement and what sobriety at the same time. Hundreds of thousands of men, probably millions of people in total. It took hours for everyone to assemble near Ramses. And just hours before, at midnight, the firstborn of all Egypt, just in that area, had perished. God's finishing, as we would say, blow to the taskmasters had at last freed the Israelites from slavery. And as we say where I grew up, boy, howdy, were they ready to leave. Like a great army, the 12 tribes of Israel, they fell in behind Moses and Aaron to begin their trip to what? The promised land. The land of sojourn of Abraham. 6 days later, they were at the edge. You remember this? If you watch Cecil B. DeMille's from the 50s, The 10 Commandments, they were at the edge of the Red Sea. And they had the mountains, the desert, the sea, and the armies coming in. Great place to be. Probably how maybe some in other nations feel when they're being invaded. And so they watched as Moses raised his... God would then part the waters so they could walk across safely. That's how the movie portrayed it. But think about this. It was not until 40 years later their descendants crossed over Jordan into their new homeland. But it was not until 40 long, hard years later that their descendants crossed over Jordan, the homeland. You ever wonder, if you ask questions, why it took 40 years? Let me ask you, some of the things you've learned, has it taken 40 years? Or 50 or 60 or 93? However many years it's been. Or if you're still in the experience like I am, you're like, very frequently I have an epiphany like, wow, why didn't I know that 40, 50 years ago? Would have been so much easier. And so even the longer route that they took was less than approximately 500 miles. They could have walked it easily, slowly in 2 to 3 months. Were they just slow? You ever think of that? Were they just slow? Was it frailty or other physical problems that slowed them down so much? Those are questions I have. If we quickly turn to Psalm 105 and verse 37, the answer, part of the answer is there. In Psalm 105 and verse 37, he says, he brought them forth also with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes. So that rules out that one. That it wasn't that they had some frailty, they were just slow. And it appears that at least the hard work they'd done in slavery had made them pretty strong. And that's one of the lessons when we go through challenges. This last song we sang, you know, our hope is in the Lord. But when you go through adversity, you know, you build stamina and strength. You know? When you pick up a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch plywood and just throw it up or however you carry it, is it heavier than it was 20 years ago? My father-in-law says when he climbs up a ladder occasionally, or he picked up the ladder, he said, it got a lot heavier. Right? And so, it wasn't that they were frail, they were strong, but within a short time after crossing the Red Sea, remember the story? Moses sent scouts out to spy out the land. And they returned after, again, 40 days to report what they had seen. It's sort of like now when people are glued to the news, which a lot of us are at times. It's interesting to hear the different reports of how people perceive that and how they read that and what they become consternated, fearful, or the opposite, stronger and resilient. And so these spies came back to report what they'd seen. It was a great land, but there was a little problem. The inhabitants were very strong and powerful. And they did the old snagglepuss routine. If you remember him, exit stage left, out of here, we're gone. And this frightened report came back for the tired and weary people. They concluded quickly, we'll never take it. We don't have a chance. This is where it began. Their failure to take the land. Is this where it began? Because fear ruled the day. I hope all of you watching will listen to what we talk about today, because it's important for all of us. Fear ruled the day. It's not unlike what we face in the country today. I'm not a prophet, partly because we're a nonprofit organization. Let that one sink in. But part of what we face in this country today, after this war settles down over in that area of the world, I, as a betting person, would bet everything I have, and I don't gamble. If I wanted to gamble, I'd be a farmer. But I would bet everything I have that there will be something else. I have a list of things of what it might be. I don't want to share that and ruin their fun. Their fun. But honestly, they just prepare whatever they do so people are afraid and dependent on someone else, something else. So Israel was afraid to follow Moses the final miles and capture the prize. He said, there's the land God promised. But, right? You ever been this in your life? Maybe a job, a business, a marriage, family, fellowship, nation, political party, whatever you are in. You begin to have, you buy a new vehicle. You heard of buyer's remorse. What did I just do? I got a payment of that per month, or I just drained my bank account down. Oh, I better take it back. Right? Very common. And so they were afraid to follow Moses, and they lacked the faith to trust their God to fight their battles for them. Are we different than that? You and me. But the problem, here's what we need to talk about. The problem began long before the report from the 12 spies. The war that we're seeing right now, and I'm not going to get into what's true and what's not and fabricated and all the slants and back and forth. That problem began several thousand years ago. And if you think that we're, thankfully in this country, we don't think like that. Really? Go back and look at your history and find out the truth. Well, what is truth? Christ and Pilate, remember that discourse? What is truth? The problem began long before the report from the 12 spies, because the source of the fear began the very day they packed up to leave Egypt. Now, wait a minute. When they left Egypt, it was the Hava Nagila, woohoo, we're out of here, dirt bags, right? Whatever they had to say. Not completely. Because something happened on that day. I'm one that likes to dig into history and find out what really happened in the Vietnam War, in World War I, in World War II, in the Korean War. What happened in the Bay of Pigs? People don't know what a lot of these are. What happened when we went into Iraq to fix the problem? Or maybe the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and Manuel Noriega. Any of that sort of ring a bell in your history? Go back and start digging, and you'll get kind of disgruntled, discouraged, and bitter if you're not careful. You can pick the history of the nation of Israel. You go through a lot of things and find out what really happened. Well, something happened on that day when they left Egypt because a decision made by the Israelites, that generation was destined to fail. The decision was a tragic one, and it denied them the heritage of the land of milk and honey. You know, remember that? It's a land of milk and honey. One time in a classroom, there was a bunch of young children, and someone said, "What do you think the land of milk and honey was like?" And they said, "Sticky." But it was a land blessed with plenty of things that were desirous and good. And that bountiful land fell to whom? Their children instead. Sometimes people, which you and I, you and me, we make choices that affect the course of our lives in unimaginable ways. Anybody here ever make a decision you're still living with that you're like, oh, if I had only done that differently? That's why hindsight is 20/20, if you learn. And so I look back at decisions I've made in my life. Some of you are privy to some of those. And here I am today because of it. And I won't bore you with my list. It's quite lengthy. And I'm sure yours has a few fill in the blanks too, doesn't it? Israel made a tragic decision on that Passover day that in a sense doomed them to failure. Paul tells us over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, those mistakes by ancient Israel were preserved for your and my And at that time, who he wrote to, they're learning. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11. All these things happened. It talks about them in the previous verses. For examples, they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. And I have to throw in verse 12 because that applies to you and me so well. Wherefore let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. This morning Anthony got up after sitting at a lengthy time in the chair to get up to go get some more coffee or whatever it was, and he kind of stumbled, and I thought, oh, hope he doesn't fall. And Gail said, you caught yourself. He said, you saw that? Because he was sore and tired from working yesterday or maybe all week or all his life. I don't know. Anybody here ever fallen? You know, and you fall and it's like, wow, I'm standing here right now. But I could fall. So could you. So he said all these things were written for our admonition. Do we read them for that? God had determined, there's no question, to free his people from slavery and bring them into a land of their own. And remember the cheery fellow Pharaoh? Everybody remember him? He was a nice guy, wasn't he? Did Yul Brynner play the Pharaoh in the movie? I think he did. Yeah. He had shorter hair than you, I think. But he's got a shaved head, by the way. But the Pharaoh at that time was the leader of the most powerful empire on earth. And he refused over and over Moses' request to let the people leave. You ever been through something like that in your life? You just want to be out of the mess that you're in, and God says, or whoever, no. I remember one time I had a job I hated. I said, I want to just quit. And they said, you can't. I said, what do you mean I can't? I said, you have a contract. I said, what did I sign? Do you remember when you signed that? Yeah. Even when you want to leave, you can't. And so Pharaoh, very hardened heart, stubborn, and by great miracles, we know the story, God brought Egypt to its knees, and he showed the impotence of its gods. Part of what we see happening in the world right now, folks, and in this nation, for those that have eyes to see, your gods will not save you. What are our gods? Our army, our economy, our leaders. Ouch. That's 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Our intelligence. This nation is filled with intelligent people. I'm reminded of it frequently by some of the younger ones. How intelligent they are. You know, the videos circulate, sometimes the personal comments. And so, Israel, through this process, had a front row seat. As God turned their precious water into, you remember this, a putrid blood, covered the land with repulsive frogs. How many of you like frogs? Yeah, you know. They're okay till one of them hits you on the face and sticks when you're walking. Then the vexatious insects like lice, right? And flies. Remember flies? Anybody like flies here? Destroyed their livestock. This fierce hailstorm, how big were those hail? How big was the hail? Painful boils. An insatiable horde of devouring locusts, and then darkness. Man, those all sound fun, don't they? You know, I mean, so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I've been in darkness like that. The mighty Egypt was hammered and battered with one plague after another. You ever feel like that in this nation? We just keep getting hit, boom, and it hasn't even gotten bad yet. You know, boom, we just one thing, and you think we'd eventually kind of wake up and say, is something not right here? But no, we just declared a disaster, federal disaster, and throw money, print money, throw it at it, and Just go along and keep going because it's never going to end, you see, because we know how to figure out all the problems, right? Well, at least you do, and I do, and we're working on it, right? Finally came, though, the most devastating of all. It really finally hit home, the death of all the firstborn. How many of you are firstborn? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 of us, 5 of us are just keeled over and dead. We're dead now. Would that get your attention? My mom's probably watching. It'd get your attention, right? Pam, you're not a firstborn, right? You are? So you and Anthony are both gone. Well, that sort of shortens things out there. So Pharaoh finally, when this happened, conceded, leave. I don't ever want to see you again. Then there's the question, was Pharaoh still alive after that? But that's for another message. To the Israelites, freedom. You remember when the hostages were released back about like 1970-something, 2 or 3? They kissed the ground when they came back to the United States. The bonds of slavery were broken. And what an opportunity. It was a chance to what? You ever go through this? Start over. How many of you have ever wanted to do that? Reset? That'd be a great reset, wouldn't it? For those that have ears. Wouldn't that be a great reset in your life if you could start over? Because that's what God's going to do. The greatest reset that ever happened. Okay? What if you could start over? And so, they then had that chance. They could leave the old life behind and build a new one in the new land. Do you remember those that came over to this country? At least the history that some have recorded says they were the first ones to come to the new, what was it called? Anybody remember? The New World, right? Remember what they'd come from? We don't remember our history very well. Rarely does an entire nation have the opportunity to make a complete geographical move and reestablish itself. Israel had only a few hours to pack, but here's what I want us to think about. In this packing, most of them made a terrible, horrible mistake. When you're leaving your home for good, and you can only take a limited amount of your belongings, what would you take? You ever thought about that? I used to, as a firefighter, respond to a scene, and there would be flames in the back of the house, and you'd see somebody in the living room grabbing things. I'd say, look, sometimes we have to physically grab them and pull them out and say, you have to leave. The gas, and then you may not have flames burning you, but you're going to die. One breath in and you're done. And you can't take that. And people would scream, no. And sometimes there was a human being caught in there. It was a horrible thing to think about. But I would say, you have 3 seconds. Grab what's important to you, and we need to go. And they would go. They couldn't decide. And so, if you could only take a limited amount of your belongings, think about it right now for a minute. What would you take? What would you grab? Well, if you're married, your husband or wife. At least try to take them, or a child, or maybe a dog or a cat. Probably leave a fish there in the water. Maybe they'd make it. I don't know. But you'd take something, maybe your Bible, or would it be your iPhone? What if you had your Bible or an iPhone? Well, my Bible's on my iPhone. Let's say it isn't on there. Which would you take? Right? You ever thought about some of this? And so they began, and I thought, and what would they leave behind? What would you leave behind? Undoubtedly, you would include those items that meant the most to you. And so would I. So, of course, here's where we're going. They took what they valued most. They took what they valued most. Here's the shocker. As the Israelites rushed around packing, selecting which items to leave and which to take, there on the shelves in their houses sat what? Their household idols. You ever thought about this? Reaching up, they tucked away these things among their precious possessions to carry to the new land. In the months and the years that followed, Moses repeatedly, it's recorded right in here, cried out against what? The worship of idols. He was not just warning them against future potential problems. He was addressing an existing problem. The idolatry they had learned in Egypt was continued throughout the whole journey. The prophet Amos, Amos chapter 5, let's go over there, one of the not-so-minor prophets. The prophet Amos wrote centuries later about the consequences of the tragic decision that the Israelites made on the Passover, that they packed their household gods. In Amos chapter 5 and verse 22 and verse 25 to 26, though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, God said, nor will I regard your fat and peace offerings. Did you offer me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? You also carried Succoth, your king, and Chuuin, your idols, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. Israel's idolatry had created a barrier between them and God. God spoke to Israel's descendants about that terrible mistake in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 4 to 8. Ezekiel 20, verse 4 to 8. God spoke to Israel's descendants about that mistake. Will you judge them, son of man? Will you judge them? Then make known to them the abominations of their fathers. Say to them, thus saith the Lord God, on the day when I chose Israel and raised my hand in an oath to the descendants of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, I raised my hand in an oath to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. On that day I raised my hand in an oath to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt into a land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands. Then I said to them, each of you throw away the abominations which are before his eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But what did they do? They rebelled against me and would not obey me. They did not cast away the abominations which before their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I will pour out my fury on them, and I fulfill my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. You see, here's the problem. They had idols in their hands and in their hearts. How many of them clasped an idol fearfully in their hands as they walked through the Red Sea, silently praying that this little idol would hold back the waters until they reached where they needed to go, to the other side? We see people doing this all the time. Look around you. We see people doing this all the time. They hold and they kiss all kinds of things. They make the sign of the cross. In the plane flights, we made a lot of them in Latin America, heavily Catholic, or Catholica as we would say. You could tell when we were landing, you just looked around, everybody doing this and scared to death. Or whenever there was any tense situation, or they would grab something off the dash of the taxi cab and kiss it, or the beads. Some have what they call their guardian angels, right? And they have those. They have things hanging from their rearview mirrors, plastered on the walls of their homes. The list goes on. And within days of reaching the shore across the expanse of water, do you remember what happened? They made themselves a golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain. Because you don't want to do something like that when a man of God is in your presence. It's better to wait till he's gone and then you do it. Right? Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 to 4. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron, and they said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go out before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. He's gone." And Aaron said, "Just be patient." Right? No. "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them all to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from their hand, he fashioned it with an engraving tool, and he made a molded calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." The question I have, was this only a replica of what they carried in here? Did they really think that it was an idol? Not God who had delivered them from slavery? Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 15 and verse 16. "So I also raised my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments and did not walk in my statutes. They profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols." Let's take a brief look. Let's go back to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 7. In Acts chapter 7 and verse 39, "To whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, and in their hearts turned back again into Egypt, saying unto Aaron, Make us gods, make a golden calf to go before us. For this Moses," by the way, God brought them out. It wasn't Moses. He was just a servant. "God, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." And they made a calf in those days, and they offered sacrifice unto the idol. They rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned. Okay? He broke, if you will, the marriage covenant. God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets. "O you house of Israel, you have offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness. Yea, you took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which you made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon." No wonder their faith failed. No wonder it failed. As the writer of the book of Hebrews said in Hebrews 3 and verse 19, "So we see they could not enter in the land because of their unbelief." God delivered them physically from Egypt for what? So they could serve Him spiritually. How much of this nation or the world is focused on serving God spiritually? How much? "I can't believe gas is so expensive." Gas is spiritual, you know. "I can't believe how terrible things are in this world, how we're treating other nations." Right? And so, when God said, "I want to serve me spiritually," they brought along the idols of their past to serve. Now you have to remember, they were part of this system for a very long time. I've been part of this worldly system for 60 plus years. I carry a lot of this system with me, and so do you. You carry a lot. We carry a lot more than we realize. They looked to these useless idols. It prevented them from what? Looking to the power of God's help. Well, thankfully, we don't do that. Yes, we do. You and I do. The same power that brought Egypt down was available to raise them up. It's the problem you and I have today, friends. It's why our nation is in so much trouble. It's why the world is in so much trouble. It's not because NATO failed. Go do your research on what NATO is. As Gomer Pyle used to say, surprise, surprise, surprise. Right? Do your research. Thankfully, we have what form of government in this country? Democracy. No. We're a federalist republic. Well, actually, we're supposed to be. Well, what's that? That's important. What's socialism? What's communism? What's Marxism? What's Scottism? What's Anthonyism? Yes. Careful how you do that, yes. We all have our vision, don't we? We all have our vision of what the world tomorrow is going to be like. Thankfully, it's all in agreement. Right? We're all in agreement on that. No, we're not all in agreement on that. We're not. And so, individually, we have many challenges we face. It was impossible for them to have the faith to believe when their confidence was directed toward the vain creation of man's making. God heard the anguished cry of his suffering, enslaved people. But of greater concern, and this is what I want us to think about too, of greater concern to God was their enslavement to the idolatrous pagan religious beliefs. He freed them from the physical, but they had to choose to be freed from the spiritual, and they didn't. God's offer to Israel included this, and here's the caveat, a demand. I don't want nobody demanding nothing from me. Do you know that God demands things from us? He's God, right? He can do that. The offer of freedom and blessings must be accompanied by total, as I spoke about recently, and exclusive, the greatest doctrine Christ ever taught, submission, as he submitted to his Father. 2 weeks ago, you can look it up on the YouTube channel. It's so difficult to submit. Why? Don't raise your hands. I'm not going to look at any of you, but how many of you wives and husbands like to submit to your mate on anything? Well, it only says wives submit to your husband. No, it doesn't. It says submit to one another in the fear of the Lord. That sort of gets overlooked and clouded and swept away and covered up. Submitting one to another in the fear of the Lord. And so God said, I am not willing to share with you any other gods, small g. And sadly, Israel never put away their idols completely and permanently. And we in this nation, and we as God's people, I ask you to consider, have we put away our idols? Have I put away the idols that I have? The obstacle was always there, constantly led them to failure after failure. In the years past, God opened our eyes, yours and mine, to see that we too were dwelling in, and we'll talk about this during the upcoming holy days more, Egypt. We call it spiritual Egypt. Do we not? We saw the paucity of purpose, the short-sightedness of our life goals. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I'm not planning on leaving this planet, or the ground rather. I'm not leaving the planet, but leaving this ground. I'm on standing and go under it and stop breathing. I'm not planning that, but none of us know. But I've started to evaluate a lot of my goals that I've had over the years, and I've had a great reshuffling of a lot of things, even in the last year or so, last few months, last weeks. As I watch everything going on in the world, I start to say, okay, what really doesn't matter? Any of you have a bucket list? I dumped my bucket and said, forget it. You know, maybe some things I'll never be able to do. I wanted to climb Half Dome or El Capitan. That's out in Yosemite. That ain't going to happen. Just not. Part of it, I don't want to go to California for anything if I can help it, but not going to happen. I physically can't do it. I'm never going to be able to run faster than my wife. I just wait at the end until she gets tired and done. There I am. But so there's things we can't do. What about spiritually? Where are you? Where am I? And so as we began, our eyes were open, God opened our minds. We said there's got to be something better. That's why people get new cars, new homes, new jobs, new husbands, new wives, new citizenship, whatever it is. New governments, new leaders. There's always something new. It's got to be better. And we cried out for deliverance in many cases, remember? Maybe you're doing that right now. God, please help me. I don't know. Through Christ, God made you and me an offer. Forgiveness of our sin and a part in his soon coming kingdom, in his kingdom. Like the offer made to ancient Israel, though, it also included a demand. God said, you cannot bring your idols. No one can serve two masters. And actually, in reality, it's more than a statue. When you and I began our spiritual journey, did we leave all of our idols behind? Did we renounce all that came between God and us, regardless of how attractive it may have appeared? Luke chapter 14, verse 33, we talk about this prior to baptism. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. What is it you have that God can't have? That you won't let him have? Or that's sacred to you? What is it? Because God says he owns everything, including you and me, and our lives. Everything. No, we got our rights. We balk at anyone saying they can have something that belongs to us. And we have to be willing to say, here it is, everything. And when we get tested with that, what do? We don't like it. It hurts, doesn't it? It's impossible to completely follow him without first forsaking all idols. An idol is not just a carving, engraving, or a mold of some strange-looking pagan god. It's not. It is anything that becomes more important than God or worshiping him. Anything. Pick what your thing is. Oh, I don't have anything. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And so do I. Anything that stands between us and our deliverer that we've been called to follow into that promised land and us can become an idol. It can be money. It can be covetousness. It can be your family. That's a big one. Your physical family. It can be ambition, recreation, lifestyle, whatever it is. You know, Jimmy Buffett has a song. He said, I made enough money to buy Miami and I just blew it. Wasted it away. Don't look up the real lyrics. He just got rid of it. He lost it all. Are there things in life that you've done or are doing or pursuing? Solomon said it's chasing after wind. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have goals. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 23 because it can manifest its way in other ways. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 23, what does it say? For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness of iniquity and idolatry, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, and has also rejected you from being king. What about pride and self-will? I've heard people say, I take great pride in the Hoefker name, using my name, so I don't select anybody. I take great pride in being a citizen of the United States of America. Thank God I'm not like all those other people. We're told to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ of that kingdom. I'm not against this government, by the way, unless I get arrested after they watch this. I'm supportive. I'm glad I live here, as long as it doesn't violate what God says. Luke chapter 14 and verse 26. Luke 14 and verse 26, it says, If any man come to me and hate not his father, mother, wife, and children and brethren, meaning love less by comparison, and yes, his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Colossians 3 and verse 5. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil lust, covetousness, which is idolatry. I think one of the biggest tests will be what will happen when your bank account is frozen and you don't have access to your money if you have some? Well, they'll never do that. Okay? Again, I'm not a prophet. What is it that's dear to you that you won't let go? And to me. You know, it's hard when you have them to see around an idol. If I hold this bottle of water right here, I can't see most of you. But if I go out here, I can see everybody except the guy in the orange shirt. Yeah, but I can see everybody else, right? But right here, I can't. We have an old saying, you can't see the forest because you keep bumping into the trees. They are, these idols you and I have, an impediment and a distraction. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2, the author of Hebrews states, Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Yeah, but they didn't have the problems we have today then. Yeah, they did. And relatively, it was the same thing. Well, they didn't have corrupt government then. Yes, they did. Well, they didn't have corrupt leadership in religion. Yes, they did. Well, they didn't have oppression. Yes, they did. They didn't have the IRS then. Yes, they did. Well, they didn't have cars, and so the gas prices weren't like they are, and the electricity, and the groceries on the shelves. Why do you think so many came for the loaves and the fishes? For a free meal that they normally couldn't afford or couldn't have. It's all a matter of perspective. God gave us this upcoming spring holy day season of the year. It says to examine ourselves and determine whether there are still things we need yet to cast aside and get rid of. That's what repentance is called. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 5 through 7, last scripture. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 5 and 7. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted, and to not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. My friends, my colleagues, my brethren, family, nothing should be so important as to prevent you and me, us, from completing our spiritual journey. As we look back at Israel's tragic decision, the question we need to ask ourselves is this: have we, you and me, you and I, thrown out all of our idols? It's a good question. It's an honest question. I pray you and I are listening to the Word of God.